Rick and Morty looks like pure chaos. A drunk scientist, a nervous kid, a burp, a portal, whatever gag hit the wall that week. But nothing on this show is an accident. A catchphrase screamed for laughs in the very first episode secretly translates to the plea of a man begging for his pain to end. This is Rick and Morty, paradoxes that prove nothing in the show was random. The show that only looks random. A single episode tends to arrive like a spill. Rick belches in the middle of a sentence, a joke lands and gets dropped before it can breathe, an alien with a ridiculous name appears for 9 seconds and dies, a portal snaps open, and the whole thing lurches to a new planet before the last idea has finished forming. On the surface, the series behaves like controlled demolition, a comedy assembled out of whatever the room could throw against the wall that week, held together by nothing sturdier than a green flask and a bad attitude. That impression is not an accident. It is the first and most successful trick the show ever pulled, the disguise it wears over everything else, and the entire purpose of the hours ahead is to peel that disguise back, one paradox at a time, until the machinery underneath is impossible to miss. The reputation for chaos was earned honestly, and it was there from the beginning. Before the series had a network or a title card, it existed as a crude short a co-creator made for a small film festival, a deliberately ugly parody of a famous time travel movie built partly to test how far a person could push parody law before a studio sent a threatening letter. The origin was a dare, a provocation, a joke about intellectual property dressed up as animation. When the short became a series, the provocation stayed baked into the tone. The dialogue itself was recorded in a way most cartoons never attempt, with one of the creators improvising in the booth from a loose outline, riffing, stumbling, burping, repeating himself, and the show kept the stumbles in on purpose. The stutters and the wet mouth sounds that define Rick were often not written at all. They were left in because they made the whole thing feel unrehearsed, like a documentary crew had wandered into a real garage and caught a real drunk mid-thought. So the texture is genuinely loose at the level of the sentence. A person could be forgiven for assuming the whole enterprise runs on that same looseness all the way down, that the plots are as improvised as the burps, that the wild swerves from a talking dog to a suicidal gas cloud to a pickle in a sewer are the products of a writer's room chasing its own tail. That assumption is where the deception does its work, because the looseness stops the moment the plot begins. Underneath the improvised surface sits one of the most rigid storytelling frameworks in television, a structure so consistent that it can be diagrammed, chanted, and applied to nearly every episode the show has ever produced. The framework belongs to the series co-creator, who has described it as a tool for removing the hard, repeated labor from the task of building a story. It is an 8-beat cycle he adapted from the old idea of the hero's journey, a shape as ancient as myth itself, reduced to a handful of blunt commands. A character sits in a familiar comfort. The character wants something. The character crosses into unfamiliar territory to chase it. The character adapts, pays a price, finds a version of what was wanted, and carries something back, arriving where they started but changed. Sources that have studied the show closely point out that this cycle is not a suggestion the writers keep in a drawer. It is the working blueprint they lay over every plot and, remarkably, over the subplots too, so that even a throwaway storyline about a father being dropped off at a daycare for fathers is quietly moving through the same 8 stations as the cosmic adventure running beside it. That is the paradox at the very floor of everything, the one that makes the rest possible. The comedy depends on feeling careless, and the carelessness is manufactured by people working with almost fanatical care. The apparent randomness is a costume stitched over an architecture. Nothing that looks tossed off is actually tossed off because the shape of the story was decided before a single line of that famous improvised dialogue was ever spoken. A show cannot plant a seed in its first season and harvest it in its 5th if it is truly making things up as it goes. It can only do that if someone, somewhere, is keeping a ledger. There is a piece of set dressing that functions as the show's own confession about all of this, and it hides in plain sight on a shelf in the garage. For years, the series held a strict internal rule against time travel. The reasoning was practical and repeated more than once by the people making it. Time travel, in their view, is a shark jumper, a toy so dangerous that the moment it enters a show's canon, it starts warping everything around it, giving characters an escape hatch from every consequence and draining tension out of every scene. Rather than simply avoid the subject quietly, the writers made a visual joke out of their own discipline. They put a cardboard box on the shelf in Rick's lab, labeled as time travel material. The idea being that the concept had been literally shelved, boxed up, and left to gather dust. A man capable of walking into any universe in existence. A man who treats planetary extinction as an afternoon errand, keeps time travel in a box he refuses to open. And the box sits there for seasons as a running gag that most viewers never even register. Consider what that box really tells anyone paying attention. It is proof that the show maintains a canon strict enough to have rules and disciplined enough to enforce them against its own protagonist, who could obviously break them at any second. A truly random comedy has no rules to break. It reaches for whatever gets the biggest laugh and never looks back. This series instead built a fence around a specific storytelling tool, marked the fence clearly, and then spent years teasing the audience with the fact that the fence existed. That is not the behavior of a show throwing darts. That is the behavior of a show guarding its own logic, because a logic worth guarding is a logic that pays off later. The clearest evidence that the writers know exactly what they are doing arrived in a fourth season episode that most people remember as one of the strangest half hours the series ever aired. In it, the family becomes trapped aboard a train that runs on the mechanics of storytelling itself, a vehicle where plot, canon, and character development are physical forces a person can be crushed by. At one point, Rick unrolls a schematic of the train so he can plan a route to the engine, and observers who know the show's process noticed something buried in that drawing. The layout of the train is the story circle. The diagram Rick uses to escape a story about storytelling is the exact 8-step loop the creator uses to write the show. The series took its own secret blueprint, printed it as a prop, and let its main character walk along it in front of everyone. And it did so as a joke about how commercialized and mechanical storytelling has become. A show that hides its structure inside a prop about structure is not a show that stumbled into being coherent. It is a show that is coherent on purpose and cannot resist showing off about it. Long before that episode, the same self-awareness was already threaded through the smaller choices. The series is famous for a certain kind of ending, the one where an adventure that seemed like disposable nonsense turns out to have quietly rewired the family or the world. A dog that was given a helmet as a minor household convenience does not simply vanish when the episode ends. Rocks that get loaded into the back of a ship in one story are the same rocks that get thrown away at the start of another. A catchphrase invented to mock the very idea of catchphrases gets a second, devastating meaning attached to it several episodes later. Each of these is a thread the writers laid down, and then, sometimes years afterward, pulled tight. And every time one of them pays off, it retroactively teaches the audience the same lesson, which is that the thing they dismissed as filler was load-bearing all along. None of this means the show is humorless, or that its randomness is fake in some cheap way. The randomness is real as an experience. The burps are real. The improvisation is real. The swerves genuinely are unpredictable in the moment. What is fake is the implication the randomness carries. The suggestion that because a scene feels unplanned, the scene must therefore be disconnected from everything else. The series exploits a natural instinct in its audience, the instinct to assume that chaos and design are opposites, that a thing which looks messy cannot also be meticulously arranged. Rick and Morty lives in the exact space where those two things stop being opposites. It is messy on the surface and arranged underneath, and the friction between those two layers is where nearly all of its best surprises are generated. The reason this matters for everything ahead is that a paradox in this show is almost never a mistake. In most stories, a paradox is a hole, a place where the logic failed and the writers hoped nobody would notice. Here, again and again, the paradox turns out to be the point, a loop the writers built deliberately and then handed to the audience as a gift, disguised as a glitch. A grandson who only exists because he saved a grandfather who only survived because the grandson existed. A book of instructions that has no author because it was was only ever copied from a future version of itself. A backstory the show insisted for years was a lie, which turned out to be almost entirely true, with only the most painful detail actually altered. These are not errors the series is embarrassed about. They are structures it is proud of, and it plants the pieces of each one far enough apart that the shape only becomes visible on a rewatch or in a long walk back through the whole run. What the series is quietly arguing across its entire existence is that the difference between a random universe and a designed one is mostly a matter of how far back a person is standing. Up close, inside a single scene, everything looks accidental. Step back across a season and patterns begin to surface. Step back across the whole show and the accidents resolve into a plan, the same way a swarm of dots resolves into a picture at the right distance. The characters themselves are trapped up close, living inside the scenes, unable to see the shape. The audience is invited to step back. That invitation is the real project of the show, and it is the reason a 2-hour walk through its paradoxes is worth taking, because the paradoxes are the places where the design pokes through the chaos and briefly shows its hand. There is a deeper irony folded into all of it that is worth sitting with before the climb begins. The man at the center of the series believes, more than anything, that nothing matters, that in an infinite multiverse, every choice is undone a billion times over, that meaning is a comforting lie people tell themselves. His whole philosophy is a case for randomness, for the idea that events are just noise, with no author and no purpose. And he lives inside a show that is the precise opposite of what he believes. A show where events are authored with obsessive care, where a joke in the second episode is a promise the writers intend to keep in the 9th season, where nothing is noise and everything is a setup waiting for its payoff. The most nihilistic character in modern television is a puppet of the most tightly plotted comedy in modern television, and he has no idea. Every time he insists that nothing is connected, the show he lives in is busy connecting everything behind his back. That gap between what Rick believes about his world and what is actually true about it is the engine under every paradox that follows. The tinkering, the revenge, the escapes, the endless portals. All of it is a man behaving as though he lives in a random universe, while the writing around him proves, quietly and relentlessly, that he does not. He treats his grandson as replaceable, and the writers make the grandson the linchpin of a time loop. He treats his family as one option among infinite copies, and the writers reveal the family was a decades-long plan. He shelves time travel to avoid consequences, and the writers build entire episodes around the consequences finding him anyway. The comedy of the show is that Rick thinks he is too smart to be caught in a story. The tragedy and the design is that he was written into the most carefully constructed story on the air. So the table is set, and the frame is simple enough to carry through everything ahead. The series wants to be received as chaos, and rewards anyone who refuses to receive it that way. Its improvised voice is a mask over a rigid skeleton. Its rules exist precisely so their eventual breaking will mean something. Its paradoxes are not failures of logic, but demonstrations of it. Closed loops the writers laid out on purpose and scattered across years so the shape would stay hidden until someone went looking. The climb from here moves through those loops one by one, each a case study in the same buried truth, that a show which spent a decade convincing the world it was making things up was, the entire time, keeping a very careful ledger, and that the wildest, most tossed off, most seemingly meaningless moments are exactly the ones with the most planning hidden inside them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first stop set the frame, a show that only looks random, hiding a machine underneath. Next, the focus turns to the purest proof of that machine, an episode where the writers finally opened the box marked time travel and built a snake war that authors itself with no author at all. Section 2, the snake war that wrote itself. Opening that shelved box was always going to be a statement. For years, the cardboard container marked time travel material had sat untouched in the garage, a running joke about a tool the writers refused to touch. And when they finally reached for it in the 4th season, they did not do it casually. They built an entire episode designed to justify their own long avoidance. A story that uses time travel so relentlessly, in so many contradictory shapes at once, that by the end, the audience understands exactly why the box stayed closed for so long. The episode is a snake war, and it is the single cleanest demonstration in the whole series of a story that authors itself with no author. A closed loop where cause and effect eat each other's tails until there is nothing left to point to as the beginning. The setup is almost aggressively small. While Rick and Morty prepare for an adventure, their ship breaks down in space, and Morty, doing repairs outside, gets bitten by a snake wearing an astronaut suit. He kills it. That should be the end of it. A minor incident, forgotten by the next scene. But Morty, carrying the guilt that defines him, cannot let a dead snake stay dead. He buys a replacement from a pet store and delivers it to the snake's home planet as a kind of apology. And that single act of misplaced conscience is the pebble that starts the avalanche. The snakes discover the replacement is not one of theirs. A creature from another world dropped into their midst, and the shock of an outside threat does to their fractured, warring society exactly what an outside threat always does. It unites them. A planet of snakes that had been busy hating one another over the color of their scales suddenly has a common enemy to organize against. And organized snakes, it turns out, invent quickly. What they invent is time travel. And the moment they have it, the episode detonates into a parody of every time travel story ever told. Robot snakes are sent back through the years to kill Morty before he can drop the replacement. Mechanical assassins with glowing red eyes lifted straight from a famous cyborg franchise. A resistance among the snakes sends its own protector back to guard him. The two factions fight across eras. A snake student travels to the past to save a snake version of a martyred president, only to return and find that the meddling has produced a snake fascist victory. So he grabs a chainsaw and jumps back in again, and the whole thing spirals into a hall of mirrors where every fix creates a worse problem. The series is not gently referencing time travel fiction here. It is cramming as many of the genre's tropes into 1/2 hour as it can hold, and it is doing so to make a specific argument, one the creators had been making from outside the show for years, that time travel is a cautionary mess, an idea that punishes anyone foolish enough to pick it up. The heart of the episode, though, the piece that makes it a genuine paradox rather than just a chaotic parody, is the book. At a certain point, Rick realizes the only way to end the snake threat is to make the snakes discover time travel much earlier than they naturally would, so their irresponsibility will burn their whole civilization down before it can become a danger. To do that, he needs to deliver a book of time travel instructions to the snakes of the past, written in a form the snakes of that era can understand. And here the episode performs its central trick. As present-day Rick and Morty stand in the snake facility, trying to figure out how to build such a thing, future versions of themselves suddenly appear and hand them the finished book, along with the devices and the disguises they will need, insult their past selves, and leave. Later, the present versions become the future versions, travel back, and hand the completed book to their own earlier selves, closing the circle. Sit with what that means, because it is the definition of the thing. The book of time travel instructions has no origin. Nobody wrote it. Present Rick received it from future Rick, and present Rick, once he becomes future Rick, hands it back to past Rick, who will one day hand it back again. The information exists in a perfect sealed loop, passed from a later self to an earlier self forever, with no moment in the timeline where anyone actually composed it from scratch. This is the shape known in physics and fiction as a bootstrap paradox, an object or a piece of knowledge that is its own cause, that exists only because it was handed backward to the point where it originated. Observers who traced the episode's roots noticed that this exact device, a journal containing the secrets of time travel handed from a future self to a past self, closely mirrors a famous old science fiction story built entirely around a man who receives his instructions from himself. The show did not invent the paradox. It knew precisely which classic loop it was reproducing, and it reproduced it faithfully. The writers creators were not subtle about signaling that this was deliberate. They embedded a second, smaller bootstrap loop inside the same episode, and this one was almost a wink. When the future Rick and Morty arrive to deliver the book, they are wearing Santa hats, because the episode takes place at Christmas. The present versions receive the hats, and later, as the future versions, they will pass those same hats back to their past selves. The hats, like the book, have no starting point. They circle endlessly between the two versions, an accessory that was never bought, never made, never given by anyone outside the loop, existing purely because it keeps being handed backward. A show throwing darts does not build a Christmas hat into a self-sustaining causal loop as a background detail. A show that understands the exact mechanics of the paradox it is playing with does, and it does it twice in one episode to make sure the point cannot be missed. The most telling flourish comes right at the seam of the loop, in a moment that most viewers laugh at without registering how carefully it was constructed. When future Morty appears to hand over the book, he has a black eye, and future Rick insults present Rick, while future Morty rudely insults present Morty. It plays as a throwaway gag, the characters being jerks to themselves, but the black eye is a promise the episode has quietly made and must keep. Because the loop is closed, everything the future versions do has to be done by the present versions when their turn comes, exactly as it was witnessed, or the loop breaks and causality collapses. So in the final scene, after the crisis is resolved, present Rick reminds Morty to stay in the car next time and then punches him in the eye, giving Morty the black eye he will have when he travels back to deliver the book. The wound was foreshadowed by its own future. Morty is injured now because he was seen injured earlier, which is to say, later. The cause of the black eye is the black eye. The episode planted the payoff at the beginning as an insult from a future self, and then circled all the way around to earn it, and the earning of it is the punch. Even the way the episode ends carries a buried acknowledgement of the shape it has drawn. When the time-traveling snakes finally push causality past its breaking point, a force of time police intervenes and erases the entire snake population, wiping out the first intelligent ancestor and unmaking the whole mess. In the final image of that erasure, observers noted, the snakes bite their own tails and form the ancient symbol of a serpent devouring itself, the Ouroboros, a figure that has stood for centuries for cyclical time, for endings that are also beginnings, for the closing of a causal loop. The show reached for the oldest possible symbol of the exact structure it had just spent an episode building. That is not a coincidence a random comedy stumbles into. That is a writing team putting a label on their own work. There is a strategic layer underneath the paradox that deserves attention too, because it reveals how tightly the plot is engineered, even at the level of character logic. Rick does not simply blunder into arming the snakes with time travel. He does it on purpose, having correctly predicted that the snakes of the past will be catastrophically irresponsible with the technology, that they will abuse it so thoroughly that they trigger their own destruction. He is running a calculated gambit, seeding a tool into the past specifically because he trusts the recipients to misuse it into oblivion. So even the paradox, even this self-authoring loop of chaos, is something Rick set in motion deliberately, a plan within a plan. The randomness of the snake war is, at bottom, engineered by a man who understood exactly how it would spiral. The episode wears mayhem on its surface and hides a chess move underneath, which is the same structure as the entire show in miniature. What makes all of this more than a clever exercise is the way it fits the series' broader philosophy about consequences. Every faction of time-traveling snakes shares one plan: to reach into the past and improve the present. And every single one of them fails, making things worse with each attempt, compounding the damage until the whole timeline has to be scrubbed clean by an outside authority. The episode is not just having fun with the genre, it is proving, through relentless demonstration, why the show shelved time travel in the first place. Meddling with time does not fix anything. It only generates more meddlers, each certain they can correct what the last one broke, until the accumulated interference destroys everything. The box on the shelf was labeled correctly. Time travel really is the dangerous toy the creators always said it was, and the episode exists to show, at length, exactly how how the danger unfolds. Even the Jerry subplot, running alongside the Snake War, is quietly braided into the same machine, which is the show's way of proving that nothing in the frame is filler. Jerry, trying to hang Christmas lights, falls off the roof, and Rick saves him by making his body lighter than air for a set number of hours, then weighting his shoes to keep him grounded. When Jerry loses a shoe, he begins to float away, and he spends the episode drifting toward the sky, reasoning grimly that he will either survive on his own or die and get Rick blamed for it. The subplot has nothing to do with snakes on its surface, but it is running the same 8-beat cycle as the main story. A man in comfort thrown out of it by a small mistake, adapting under pressure, and it resolves through the same theme of consequences chasing a character who thought he could avoid them. The show refuses to let even the silliest B story float free of its structure, which is fitting for an episode about how nothing ever truly escapes causality. The series was fully aware that breaking its own rule was a risk, and it addressed that awareness inside the story itself. The creators had said for years that time travel would corrupt the canon, and rather than pretend they were not breaking their own law, they made the episode a demonstration of why the law existed. It is the rare case of a show violating its most cherished restriction, and using the violation to argue that the restriction was right all along. By packing every time travel trope into a single half hour, and then averting most of them, wiping the snakes from existence, and sending the family back to a normal Christmas, the writers got to play with the toy once, prove it was as dangerous as advertised, and put it back in the box. The rule survived by being broken exactly once, deliberately, in a controlled demolition designed to reinforce it. Step back from the snakes and the hats and the black eye, and what remains is the purest example of the show's central claim about itself. A story that appears to be pure escalating nonsense, a comedy about racist snakes inventing time machines and fighting robot versions of themselves across history, is in fact a flawlessly closed causal loop, a bootstrap paradox executed with textbook precision, garnished with a second bootstrap loop for emphasis, sealed with a punch that the episode's own future demanded, and stamped with the oldest symbol humanity has for cyclical time. Every piece connects. The book causes itself. The hats cause themselves. The wound causes itself. Nothing in the loop was random, because a loop, by definition, cannot contain randomness. It can only contain the pieces that make it close. That is why this episode belongs so early in the climb. It is the show demonstrating, in the most literal way available, that it can build a story with no loose ends because there is no beginning for the ends to hang from. Everything that enters the loop was placed there on purpose to make the loop complete. And once a person has watched the series construct a perfect closed circle out of snakes and Christmas hats, the harder question becomes impossible to unask. If the writers can seal a loop this tight inside a single episode, what have they been sealing across the whole run? In the places where the loop is too large to see at a glance, where the payoff sits not 2 scenes away, but 5 seasons later, and where the character caught inside it is not a snake, but a boy who is born to save the man who made him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Snake War showed a loop small enough to fit inside one episode, a story that authors itself with no author. Next, the focus turns to a far larger loop, the one at the center of the whole series, where a grandson exists only because he saved a grandfather who only survived because that grandson was born. Section 3, the grandson who causes himself. Long before the reveals, before the Citadel and the Revenge and the wife who was erased from existence, there was a boy in a basement being told he would never be allowed to leave. In the closing minutes of the very first episode, Rick delivers a rambling, half-drunk speech to a terrified Morty, insisting that the two of them are the only friends either of them will ever have, that the outside world is an enemy, that they will run around together forever. And then the speech decays into something stranger than a pep talk, a stuttering incantation that trails off into gibberish. Rick keeps repeating their names over and over, 100 years, 100 times, forever, until the language dissolves into a chant that sounds less like a grandfather reassuring a child and more like a man reciting a spell he cannot stop casting. Most people watched it once, once, laughed at how unhinged it was, and moved on. Almost nobody realized they had just heard the show describe its own deepest structure in the opening episode, in a monologue that pretends to be nonsense. That chant is the first hint that the series is thinking in loops, and the loop it is most quietly obsessed with is the one that produced Morty himself. To understand why the grandson sits at the center of a paradox, the pieces have to be laid out in the order the show eventually revealed them, which is nearly the reverse of the order in which they happened. For most of the run, the audience believed the Morty they were following was simply Rick's ordinary grandson, a nervous kid pulled out of school for adventures. The truth, assembled across years, is far more tangled. The Rick at the center of the series lost his own wife and his own young daughter to a rival version of himself, which means in his original reality, there was no surviving Beth to grow up and have children, and therefore no Morty of his own blood ever existed there at all. He spent decades hunting the killer, failed, and finally settled in a different dimension, moving into the empty space left by a Rick who had abandoned his family, taking up residence beside a Beth who had survived, and her son. So the relationship that the whole show is built on was, from Rick's side, a substitution. He did not raise this Morty from birth. He arrived in the boy's life, already grown into the bitter old man, an intruder slotting himself into a family that was not originally his, in the hope that the reality's native Rick, the one who killed his wife, might one day return so he could be ambushed. The domestic premise, the grandfather and grandson in the garage, was a stakeout dressed as a family. That much is settled inside the writing, laid out plainly across the 5th season finale and the 6th season premiere, and it means the bond at the heart of the series is already circular in a quieter way. A man seeking revenge for a family he lost by inserting himself into a copy of that family, loving a grandson who is a stand-in for children who were murdered before they could grow up. But the show reaches for an even tighter loop than that, and here the ground has to be flagged carefully, because part of it lives in the official comics rather than the episodes. In a comic published under the show's banner, the series established that a version of Morty is caught in a genuine time paradox of the most vertiginous kind. The logic runs like this. Rick only got to have a family, only found his way to the life he ended up living, because at a crucial moment, a Morty intervened and saved his life. But that Morty could only exist because he was born, and he was only born because Rick lived long enough to have descendants, which he only did because the Morty saved him. Each event requires the other to have already happened. The grandson saves the grandfather, which allows the grandson to be born, which allows the grandson to save the grandfather. Neither can come first, and yet both must. It is the same shape as the snake book from the previous episode, a thing that is its own cause, except here, the object caught in the loop is not a manual or a Christmas hat. It is a person. It is the show's second lead. That comic detail is not, strictly, the television canon, and it should be held at arm's length as an official but separate source, rather than a confirmed fact of the main series. What matters is that the writers, working across the franchise, were willing to state outright that Morty's very existence could be a closed causal loop, a boy who exists only because he ensured his own existence. And the reason that idea resonates so strongly is that the television show, in its own dialogue and imagery, keeps circling the same territory, keeps suggesting, without fully committing, that the whole thing might be a cycle that feeds itself. The pilot chant is the seed of it. Rick and Morty forever, over and over, 100 years, 100 times. Read as the ravings of a drunk, it is a joke. Read against everything that came later, it is a thesis statement about a life lived on repeat. A grandfather and grandson locked into a pattern that recurs endlessly. The same adventures, the same dynamic, the same escape from consequence, running in a groove that never breaks. A fan theory that gained traction argues that the series is literally a time loop, that this is why so many later episodes carry a feeling of familiarity, of things having happened before. That theory is exactly that, a theory, unconfirmed by the show, and it should not be presented as fact. But the interesting thing is how deliberately the series feeds it, how the writers keep laying out breadcrumbs that point toward a cycle without ever saying the word. The most striking of those breadcrumbs Breadcrumbs is a callback the show placed at the emotional peak of its 7th season, and it connects directly back to the pilot chant. In the episode where Rick finally corners and kills the rival who murdered his family, the culmination of the entire series-long revenge plot, the moment is scored not as triumph, but as emptiness. Rick stands over the body of his nemesis with nothing left to organize his life around, staring into space with the blank, thousand-yard stare of a man who has lost his only purpose. And observers noticed that this image, this specific defeated posture with this specific melancholy music, is a direct visual echo of an earlier moment from the very first season, from the episode where Morty first had to bury his own dead body in the backyard after Rick poisoned their original world. The show reached back across 6 seasons to rhyme its darkest victory with its earliest trauma, staging the grandfather's hollow win in the exact pose of the grandson's first great wound. The language rhymes too, and this is where the pilot chant returns to close a loop of its own. In that same 7th season episode, when the villain, Evil Morty, finds Rick drunk and defeated on the floor of the garage, the scene is built to mirror the pilot, Rick sprawled and slurring, the cycle apparently completing. And the show's own vocabulary keeps pulling the same phrase forward. In an earlier episode about a device that seemed to let Morty reset time like a video game, Rick eventually reveals that the boy did not perform do-overs at all. He tells Morty in a line that lands like a stone that there were no do-overs, that Morty did it over and over. That phrase, over and over, is the pilot chant's phrase, the exact rhythm Rick fell into while promising Morty 100 years of adventures. The show keeps returning to the idea of repetition, of an action performed again and again with the illusion of a fresh start, and it keeps attaching that idea to Morty specifically, the character it may or may not have trapped in a loop of his own existence. There is a purpose to this insistence beyond cleverness, and it ties the grandson's paradox to the show's central emotional argument. Rick's entire philosophy is that nothing matters because everything repeats infinitely. In an endless multiverse, he insists, every version of every person exists a billion times over. Every tragedy is undone in a billion neighboring realities, and so no single life carries any weight. That worldview is a form of the loop, a belief that existence is just the same patterns cycling forever with no meaning attached. And the cruel joke the writing keeps setting up is that Rick built his life around a grandson who might be the one exception to that rule, a boy whose existence is not infinitely repeatable, but singular in the strangest way, a person who exists only because he caused himself. If Morty is a closed loop, then Morty is, in a sense, necessary, load-bearing, irreplaceable, the one thing in Rick's random multiverse that could not simply be swapped for a copy without the whole structure collapsing. This is why the show is so careful about the reason Morty's travel beside Rick's at all, a detail established early and never softened. A Morty's mind, the series explains, gives off a kind of interference that masks the distinctive brainwaves of a Rick, which makes a Rick moving through the multiverse with a Morty in tow far harder for enemies to track. On the surface, this is a cold, dehumanizing fact, the grandson reduced to camouflage, a cloaking device that happens to love the man using it. But viewed through the loop, it becomes something more disturbing. The reason Rick needs a Morty is the reason Rick keeps a Morty is the reason a Morty exists to be needed. The camouflage and the affection and the paradox are all the same circle. Rick tells himself the boy is equipment. The writing suggests the boy is the axle the whole thing turns on. The series dramatized the horror of this most directly in an episode about the video game called Roy, a life simulator inside an arcade where a player lives an entire ordinary human lifetime in a headset. In a later visit to that arcade, a power surge splinters Morty's consciousness across the billions of characters inside the game, so that every single non-player person in Roy's world is a tiny fragment of Morty, each speaking in a slight variation of his voice, none of them aware of what they are. To rescue him, Rick enters the game and tries to explain to these fragments that they are all, unknowingly, pieces of one boy, his grandson, scattered and multiplied. They refuse to believe it. They treat the truth as a cult, a religion, an absurd doctrine that one man could be the source of them all. The episode is a comedy, but underneath it is running the show's obsession in yet another key. The idea of a single Morty fractured into countless copies who cannot grasp their own origin. A boy who is somehow both one person and a billion, both singular and endlessly repeated, which is exactly the contradiction the loop implies. None of this is the show announcing a solution. The series is careful never to fully confirm that it is a time loop, never to state outright that Morty caused his own birth in the main continuity, never to resolve the tension between Rick's belief in infinite replaceable copies and the possibility that his grandson is the one irreplaceable thing in his life. It keeps the contradiction open on purpose, because the contradiction is more useful unresolved. It lets the show argue without ever having to prove that meaning and repetition are not opposites, that a thing can be caught in an endless cycle and still be the most important thing in the story. Rick preaches that repetition drains meaning. The writing keeps suggesting that the most meaningful figure in the entire series is the one most deeply caught in a repeating loop. What is settled and what matters most is the discipline behind all of it. A show does not open its pilot with a chant about 100 years of repetition and then 6 seasons later stage its climactic revenge as a visual echo of its pilot-era trauma, and then reuse the phrase over and over at the emotional center of a save state episode by accident. Those are threads laid down and pulled tight across the entire run. Whether or not Morty literally causes his own existence in the television canon, the writers have spent a decade treating him as the show's recurring axis, the fixed point everything else rotates around, the one character whose arc bends back to touch its own beginning. The grandson is where the series keeps testing its own biggest question, whether a life that runs in circles can still matter. And it answers that question not with a speech, but with structure, by making the boy at the center of the loop the boy the whole show cannot do without. That is the paradox this stop was built to hold. The grandfather believes nothing is unique because everything repeats. The grandson may be unique precisely because he repeats. A person who exists only by ensuring he exists. A closed loop, wearing a child's face. And the show planted the first clue in a drunken chant in its opening minutes. 100 years, over and over, forever. Then spent the rest of its life proving that the chant was not gibberish at all. It was a map. From here, the climb moves from the loops the show builds around its plot to the loops it hides inside its smallest details. The throwaway lines and background props that turned out, seasons later, to have been holding the truth the entire time. Starting with a catchphrase that a whole generation shouted for laughs without ever hearing what it actually said. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This stop followed the loop at the heart of the show, a grandson who may exist only because he saved the man who made him. Next, the focus turns to the smallest planted detail of all, a nonsense catchphrase invented as a joke, which secretly confessed the deepest wound in the series years before the show admitted it out loud. Section 4. The catchphrase that was always a cry for help. Some jokes are built to be laughed at and then forgotten. This one was built to be laughed at and then, years later, to reach back and change the meaning of every laugh that came before it. In the first season, Rick develops a catchphrase, a burst of cheerful nonsense he throws out whenever a plan lands, or a joke sticks, or a fart goes off just right. It is the kind of thing a cartoon character says, wubba-lubba-dub-dub. It scans as pure silliness, a string of baby sounds a drunk grandfather shouts to punctuate his own excitement. And that is exactly how the audience received it at first, as a bit of goofy branding, the sort of catchphrase every comedy hangs on its lead so it can be printed on a shirt. What almost nobody realized on first watch was that the writers had planted a landmine inside the silliness, and that the landmine would take most of a season to go off. The origin of the phrase is itself a small joke about jokes, which makes what happened next even sharper. According to the creators, the catchphrase was invented specifically to mock the very idea of catchphrases. They were poking fun at the way sitcom and cartoon characters get saddled with a signature line. line, a whoop or a bazinga, a piece of merchandise-ready nonsense that stands in for personality. The first time Rick uses it, he even name-checks a real talk show host famous for getting his audience to whoop, framing the whole thing as a parody of that kind of empty, crowd-pleasing noise. So the phrase entered the show as a critique of phrases, a deliberately hollow sound meant to satirize how hollow such sounds usually are. The writers were, in effect, mocking the audience's appetite for a catchphrase by giving them the emptiest one imaginable. And then, exactly as they had predicted and feared, the audience loved it. The nonsense caught fire. It became a meme, a rallying cry, the thing fans shouted to prove they were fans, printed on shirts and tattooed on skin, the precise phenomenon the creators had been trying to satirize. The parody backfired so completely that it became the very thing it was making fun of. But the writers had already installed the trapdoor, and the trapdoor is what separates this from an ordinary catchphrase and turns it into one of the show's cleanest examples of a detail that was never random. Because the meaning of the phrase had already been decided, and it had nothing to do with joy, the reveal comes in the 11th episode of the first season, during a party at Rick's house. Bird Person, Rick's oldest friend, a solemn warrior who has known him since their days fighting a galactic war together, is talking to Morty, and Bird Person explains, calmly and without drama, that the catchphrase is not nonsense at all. In the language of his people, wubba lubba dub dub translates to something specific. It means the speaker is in great pain and is begging for help. Morty, hearing this, immediately dismisses it, insisting his grandfather is only saying it as a joke, saying it ironically. And that dismissal is the whole tragedy in miniature, because the boy closest to Rick, the one who spends nearly every day beside him, cannot accept that the cheerful old man is broadcasting a distress signal in plain sight, disguised as a punchline. Consider the machinery of what the writers did there. They took the emptiest possible sound, a phrase engineered to have no meaning, a satire of meaning itself, and they revealed that it had been the most meaningful thing Rick ever said, hidden the entire time behind its own stupidity. Every earlier moment Rick shouted it in apparent triumph retroactively curdles. The times he yelled it while celebrating a plan, while making a joke, while doing something reckless and pleased with himself, all of it becomes, in hindsight, a man screaming that he is in agony and needs help, in a language nobody around him bothers to understand, at a volume that reads as delight. The joy was the disguise. The catchphrase was the wound wearing a party hat. And the show planted the reveal a full 10 episodes after establishing the phrase, far enough apart that the audience had already accepted the sound as meaningless, which is precisely what made the reversal land so hard. There is a detail in the phrase's construction history that reveals just how much the writers understood about what they were building. By their own account, the dark meaning was added as an afterthought, layered onto the nonsense for an extra dose of tragic irony. That omission is important because it shows the show's method in action. The creators did not always know every payoff from the start. What they had was an instinct to leave hooks in place, to take a joke and quietly attach a deeper resonance to it that could be paid off later, to treat even a satirical throwaway as a potential seed. The catchphrase was not planted years in advance with a master plan attached. It was planted as a joke, and then the writers recognized the opportunity to make it mean something, and they took it. That is the difference between true randomness and the show's kind of designed randomness. The surface was improvised. The willingness to make the surface matter was not. What makes the phrase such a perfect case study is how it demonstrates the show's habit of hiding its emotional core inside its most disposable elements. Rick and Morty is a series obsessed with a specific idea, that its lead is a brilliant, godlike man who is, underneath the genius, in constant and dangerous pain, and that he has spent his entire life building elaborate distractions to avoid feeling it. The catchphrase is that idea compressed into 3 words of gibberish. A man in great pain, begging for help, in a form that guarantees no one will hear the plea, because he has coded it as a joke. That is not just a clever bit of wordplay. It is the entire character rendered as a single sound. The show's thesis about Rick, that his humor is a shield and his brilliance is an avoidance mechanism and his cheer is a lie, is all sitting there in the catchphrase, planted in the first season, waiting. fighting. The reveal also recontextualizes the friendship it comes wrapped in, which is another thread the show pulls tight much later. It is Bird Person, specifically, who knows the true meaning of the phrase, and that detail is not incidental. Bird Person is established across the series as Rick's oldest and perhaps only genuine friend, a comrade from the war Rick fought long before he became the bitter old man in the garage. The fact that Bird Person knows what the catchphrase really means implies a depth of history between them, a closeness in which Rick either confided his pain directly or in which their shared past is so deep that the understanding is simply assumed. The person who can translate Rick's disguised cry for help is the one person who knew Rick before the disguises hardened. So the reveal does double duty. It exposes Rick's hidden pain, and it quietly establishes that there was a time and a person for whom Rick did not have to hide it, which makes the current isolation, the fact that he now shouts his agony at a grandson who laughs it off, land even heavier. The show kept the phrase alive as a running thread across years, and its evolving use is itself a piece of careful design. In the early seasons, Rick says it constantly, at the height of its meaning, when the audience is still learning what it hides. In later seasons, he says it far less, and the show makes the fading itself meaningful. By the time the series reaches its later years, the phrase has become something the fans demand, and Rick increasingly refuses to give them. In one episode, the show directly addresses this, with Morty pointing out that the audience of their in-universe podcast wants Rick to say the catchphrase, and Rick declining. The show turned its own catchphrase into a commentary on catchphrases, and on fandom's hunger to hear a beloved line repeated, closing a loop that started with a satire of exactly that hunger. The phrase was born mocking the fan appetite for catchphrases, became the very catchphrase it mocked, and then, in Rick's refusal to perform it on command, became a mockery of that appetite all over again. The satire ate itself and came out the other side. Even the wider world got folded into the phrase's afterlife in a way the show clearly enjoyed. For a stretch, typing the catchphrase into a major search engine would return a suggestion asking whether the searcher meant a statement about being in great pain and needing help. The engine had been programmed to recognize the phrase and reply with its hidden translation, which meant the joke about a secret cry for help had escaped the show entirely and lodged itself in the infrastructure of the internet. A person shouting the phrase for fun, celebrating their fandom, would be quietly answered by a machine offering to help them with their pain. The recursion of that is almost too neat. The empty catchphrase that secretly means suffering, echoed back at anyone who searches for it as a question about their suffering. A distress signal bouncing off the walls of the web. The deeper point, the one that makes this stop essential to the larger argument, is what the catchphrase proves about the show's relationship to its own throwaways. The single silliest, most disposable, most merchandise-ready element in the entire series, the thing most obviously designed to mean nothing, turned out to contain the show's most important truth about its main character. If the emptiest sound in the show was secretly the fullest, then nothing in the show can be safely dismissed as empty. That is the lesson the catchphrase teaches on a rewatch. And it is the lesson that makes every other planted detail worth hunting for. The writers demonstrated, with 3 words of baby talk, that they were willing to hide the heart of the show inside its dumbest joke, which means the dumbest jokes deserve a second look. There is a quieter tragedy folded into the phrase that the show never states outright but keeps gesturing toward, and it connects to the series' whole portrait of Rick as a man who cannot ask for what he needs. Rick is, by the show's own accounting, an emotionally illiterate genius, a man who understands feelings perfectly in others and refuses to acknowledge them in himself, who expresses love through action and never through words, who would rather do anything than admit he is suffering. The catchphrase is the exact shape of that pathology. It is a cry for help he cannot stop himself from making, but which he has encoded so thoroughly that it registers to everyone as its opposite. He is, in the most literal sense, telling the truth about his pain constantly, out loud to everyone, and the truth is safe because it is buried inside a joke. That is not a man who refuses to ask for help. That is a man who asks for help all the time, in a language he has guaranteed no one will translate. And the one person who can translate it is a friend from a life he no longer lives. lives. The catchphrase, in the end, is the show in a single detail. It looks random. It was designed as a satire of randomness. It became the thing it satirized. And underneath all of that, from the very beginning, it carried the truest, saddest, most carefully placed meaning in the series. A meaning the writers layered in as an afterthought and then honored for years, letting it fade and return and comment on itself until a piece of gibberish became one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever wrote. A whole generation learned to shout it for fun. Almost none of them heard what they were saying. And that gap between the laughing crowd and the buried plea is the exact gap the show lives in. The space where chaos on the surface hides design underneath, where the dumbest joke is the deepest wound, and where nothing, not even a string of nonsense syllables, was ever actually random. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A catchphrase hit a wound in plain sight, planted as a joke and honored for years. Next, the focus turns to a detail that hid an entire invasion, a smear of color on a background prop the writers planted 2 full episodes before the apocalypse it caused. Section 5. The apocalypse hidden in the scenery. A background prop is the safest place in television to hide something, because a background prop is the one thing nobody is looking at. The eye follows the characters, tracks the dialogue, waits for the joke. It does not scan the clutter on a shelf or the rocks in the back of a ship for clues, because clutter is supposed to be clutter, filler that fills space and means nothing. Rick and Morty understood this better than almost any show on the air, and in its second season, it performed a magic trick built entirely on that blind spot. It planted a full-scale alien invasion inside its own scenery, in a spot so easy to overlook that the creators themselves later admitted they were surprised anyone ever caught it, and the payoff arrived 2 whole episodes after the seed was buried. The seed sits in an episode about an arms deal and an arcade, a story remembered for a singing gas cloud, and a virtual reality game where a person lives an entire lifetime in a headset. Amid all of that, in a moment nobody has any reason to study, Rick collects a load of rocks and stows them in the back of his ship. It is a nothing beat, the kind of incidental action that fills the seconds between the parts of the plot that matter. Rocks in a ship, a scientist gathering specimens or junk or whatever. There is no dialogue drawing attention to it, no lingering shot, no music sting. The rocks are furniture. And on one of those rocks, if a person freezes the frame and looks hard, there is a small pink blob, a smear of color, easily mistaken for a mineral vein or a trick of the light, sitting there in the background while the actual episode happens somewhere else on the screen. That pink blob is a parasite pod, and it is the origin of a catastrophe that will not detonate until 2 episodes later. In the later story, the family's home is overrun by alien parasites that reproduce by burrowing into people's minds and implanting false memories, filling the house with wacky, invented characters who feel like beloved old friends because the parasites have manufactured warm histories with each of them. The infestation nearly destroys the family, forces them to turn on one another, and ends in genuine tragedy. And the entire plague traces back to those rocks, because the parasites hitched a ride into the house on the very specimens Rick had casually loaded into his ship 2 episodes earlier, in a scene that had nothing visibly to do with them. The bookends confirm it. At the start of the parasite episode, Rick is seen throwing the same rocks away, disposing of the source of the infestation right there on screen, in a gesture that means nothing to a first-time viewer and everything to anyone who has seen where the rocks came from. The confirmation that this was deliberate did not come from a fan squinting at freeze frames. It came from the creator himself. In an interview, he explained plainly that the parasite infestation originated from the rocks, that the pink pods are visible on the specimens in the earlier episode, and that he did not think too many people had caught it. He was, in effect, giving the audience the answer to a puzzle most of them had never realized was a puzzle, revealing that a background detail in one episode was the cause of a disaster 2 episodes later, planted quietly and left to sit in the scenery until it mattered. That is the show's method, stated out loud by the man who runs it. The catastrophe was on on screen, in the background, the entire time. The audience simply was not looking, because they had been trained by every other show to believe the background does not matter. The Parasite episode itself deepens the design, because it is not merely the payoff of the rock. It is a masterclass in the show's obsession with details that only reveal their meaning on a second pass. The rule of the parasites is established midway through, and it is elegant. The creatures can only implant good memories. Every false friend they conjure comes wrapped in warm, pleasant recollections, fun adventures, cozy history, nothing unpleasant. This means the family can eventually distinguish the real from the fake by a brutal logic. Anyone they can only remember fondly, with no bad memories at all, must be a parasite, because real relationships accumulate friction, irritation, disappointment. Only a manufactured friend is purely pleasant. So the family begins killing everyone in the house they have no negative memories of. And the horror of the episode is watching them use love as the marker for death. And here the show plants a second, subtler trap, one that rewards the same careful attention as the rocks. Into this parasite-infested house walks a new character, a small yellow creature with a tall head, a beloved family friend named Mr. Poopy Butthole. He appears, like all the parasites, as someone who has supposedly always been there, someone the family remembers warmly. He even appears in the episode's opening credits, inserted into every scene of the title sequence, as though he had been part of the show from the start, which is the exact behavior of a parasite rewriting the family's history. Everything about him screams that he is one of the invaders, that he will be exposed and killed like the rest. The audience is primed to see him as the ultimate fake, but the show buried the truth of him in the same place it buried the rocks, in the details a person has to work to notice. Because the parasites can only create good memories, the way to spot a real person is to find a bad memory attached to them. And Mr. Poopy Butthole, alone among the suspicious new characters, comes with an unpleasant memory. He brings up a time the family was trapped in an elevator together after a musical, a moment initially presented as awkward and irritating before another parasite rewrites it. That flicker of a bad memory is the tell. The show even structured his appearances in the altered opening credits around this rule, placing him in scenes that read as bad memories, so that a viewer paying close enough attention could deduce he was real before the episode confirmed it, precisely because the writers followed their own logic with total consistency. The clue to his reality was hidden in the very thing that made him look fake. The reveal is a gut punch that only works because of that buried logic. At the end of the episode, with the parasites finally destroyed, the family sits down to dinner, and Beth, still suspicious of how uniformly pleasant her memories of Mr. Poopy Butthole are, shoots him, certain he is the last parasite. He does not dissolve into a monster. He is blasted into the wall, bleeding, terribly and unmistakably real. A genuine friend the family has no bad memories of, not because he is fake, but because he was simply that good a person to be around. Beth, realizing what she has done, staggers into the kitchen and pours herself a drink with shaking, tear-blinded hands. The joke of the whole episode, the reveal that the one character who looked most like a parasite was the only new arrival who was real, lands because the show played fair, hiding the evidence of his reality inside the exact details it had taught the audience to read, if only the audience had been reading. Mr. Poopy Butthole then did something no parasite in the episode did. He survived, and he stayed, becoming a recurring figure who appears in post-credits scenes to address the audience directly, the only character besides Rick who breaks the fourth wall. And his continued existence created a genuine mystery the show has never fully closed, which is why he is worth dwelling on as more than a punchline. If he was real all along, why had the family never mentioned him before? And how did he insert himself into the opening credits like he had always been there? The creator offered a theory, carefully framed as a theory rather than canon, and it is one of the most revealing things he ever said about how the show thinks. He suggested that Mr. Poopy Butthole might be a different, more advanced species than the parasites, a benevolent creature that blooms where the parasites bloom, the way spiders appear where flies appear, a being not bound by ordinary space and time, who inserts himself into the holes that misperception and temporal breakdown leave behind. In that reading, Mr. Poopy Butthole burrows into the gaps the parasites create, but harmlessly, and the same power that lets him do that is is the power that lets him speak directly to the viewer. That theory should be held exactly as what it is, an unconfirmed idea the creator floated, not a settled fact of the show. But it matters because of what it reveals about the writer's instincts. Faced with an apparent inconsistency, a character who came from nowhere, the show's first impulse was not to shrug and call it a joke. It was to reach for an explanation elaborate enough to make even the inconsistency intentional, to fold the loose thread back into the fabric, to argue that the character who seemed most random was actually operating on rules more sophisticated than the ones around him. That is the show's reflex, visible even in interviews. When something looks like a mistake, the writers would rather build a theory that makes it deliberate than admit it was an accident. Whether or not the theory is true, the instinct behind it is the whole point. This is a show that cannot leave a loose end loose, that treats even its own apparent errors as puzzles to be solved rather than flaws to be forgotten. The Parasite episode also connects to the show's larger structural discipline in a way that reinforces everything the earlier stops established. It is, in form, a clip show parody, an episode that appears to be padding itself out with flashbacks, the cheapest and laziest format television has. But the flashbacks are the plot. Each false memory is the mechanism by which the parasites reproduce. So the thing that looks like filler, the recycled clips, is actually the engine of the entire threat. The show took the most disposable format available and made the disposability itself the story, hiding the plot inside the thing that looks like an absence of plot. That is the same trick as the rocks, the same trick as the catchphrase, executed at the level of episode structure. The filler is not filler. The background is not background. The clip show is not a clip show. Every layer that looks like nothing is doing work. What ties the rocks and the parasites and Mr. Poopy Butthole together into a single lesson is the show's confidence that its audience would eventually look closer. The creators planted a pink blob so small most people missed it, and then waited, content that the detail would sit there, rewarding the few who froze the frame, and that the reveal in the interview would send everyone back to check. They built an episode whose central twist depends on the viewer noticing which memories are unpleasant, trusting that the logic would hold up under scrutiny, and they left a character dangling as an apparent inconsistency, then spun a theory to make even that deliberate. Every choice assumes a viewer who does not accept the surface, who suspects that the background is hiding something, who is willing to go back and look. The show was, in a sense, training its audience to distrust the appearance of randomness, using the parasites to teach the exact skill the whole series rewards. There is a final, quiet irony in the fact that the parasites' entire method is the manufacture of false memories, of history that never happened, inserted so smoothly that it feels real, because that is, in a way, what a poorly written show does to its audience, papering over its gaps with things that seem like they were always there. Rick and Morty made an episode about that exact crime, and then refused to commit it, planting the real cause of the invasion 2 episodes early, so that nothing had to be invented after the fact, hiding the evidence of a character's reality inside the logic of the threat, and treating even its own loose ends as problems to be solved rather than holes to be spackled. The parasites cheat by inventing the past. The show refused to cheat and buried its past in plain sight instead. The apocalypse was hidden in the scenery the whole time, on a rock in the back of a ship, a smear of pink that a person could watch 100 times without seeing. And once a viewer knows it is there, it is impossible to unsee. Impossible to go back to believing the rocks were just rocks. That is the show's deepest habit, laid bare in a single background detail. It puts the catastrophe on screen long before the catastrophe arrives, trusts the audience to miss it, and rewards the ones who do not. From a disaster hidden in the scenery, the climb now turns to the largest hidden structure of all, one that was not tucked into a corner of a single frame, but built silently across the entire multiverse. A wall the show spent years mentioning in fragments before revealing that it explained the premise of the whole series, and that the man everyone called the smartest in the universe had rigged the game before the first episode ever aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show buried a catastrophe in its own scenery and dared the audience to find it. Next, the climb turns to the largest hidden structure of all, a wall built silently across the entire multiverse, revealed to explain the premise of the whole series. Section 6, The Wall Around the Whole Show. The biggest hidden structure in the series was not tucked into a corner of a single frame. It was built across the entire multiverse, in silence, mentioned only in fragments for years before the show admitted what it was. And when the admission finally came, it did something no background rock or buried catchphrase could do. It reached backward and rewrote the premise of the whole series. Everything the audience had been told about the man at the center, the one fact nearly every character agreed on, turned out to be a rigged result the show had been quietly setting up since the beginning. The smartest man in the universe was never smartest in the universe. He was smartest inside a cage he had helped build to guarantee that answer, and the cage was named the Central Finite Curve. To understand why this counts as the show's grandest planted structure, the shape of the setup has to be traced the way the writers laid it, because they did not dump it all at once. From the first season, the series established a fact and repeated it until it hardened into the rule of the world. Rick Sanchez is the smartest being in existence. The Galactic Federation files him as a threat worth an entire prison wing. An interdimensional government made of nothing but other versions of him treats this particular Rick as the most dangerous of all of them. His enemies plan around the assumption that he is already 3 moves ahead. The audience, hearing this from every direction, stopped questioning it and filed it away as simply true, the given premise the rest of the show is built on. And that unquestioned acceptance is exactly the condition the eventual reveal needed, because a rigged game only shocks the people who believed the game was fair. The fragments started early and looked, at the time, like ordinary world building. There was a society of Ricks, a whole city of them, governing themselves, organizing into a council, running an entire civilization populated by nothing but the same man and the grandsons assigned to them. There was the recurring detail that the multiverse contains endless versions of everyone, that any given Rick is one of countless copies. There was the strange consistency that the Ricks always seemed to be the top of every ladder, the smartest in every room, the apex of every reality they visited. None of this registered as a clue on first viewing. It read as the show's premise, the infinite multiverse playground where a genius could hop between worlds. What the audience did not know was that the flatness of the playing field was itself the mystery, that the reason a Rick was always the smartest being present was not luck or talent, but selection, and that the selection had a name and a builder. The name arrived late, threaded through the 5th season, and paid off across the 7th. And the concept is deceptively simple. The multiverse Rick travels is not raw, open, infinite reality. It is a curated slice of it, a band of universes the Ricks themselves carved out and sealed off, chosen so that inside that band, in every single reality, a Rick is the smartest being present. That is the Central Finite Curve. It is a fence drawn around the only stretch of existence where the outcome was guaranteed in the Rick's favor, with everything outside the fence thrown away. The Ricks did not earn the top of the ladder across all of creation. They pre-filtered creation down to the region where they could not lose, and then they lived inside it and called themselves supreme. The smartest man in the universe is smartest inside a universe he helped handpick for that exact result. The reveal recolors everything that came before it, which is what makes it the show's most audacious act of retroactive design. Every feat the audience had filed under genius now carries an asterisk, because the contest was held on a stacked board. Every time Rick outthought an enemy, he did it inside a reality selected to contain no one who could outthink him. The premise the show spent years establishing, the smartest man in the universe, was not a description. It was the visible surface of a hidden structure, a boast that only held because the man making it had quietly deleted every reality that would have exposed it as false. The show planted the phrase, let it harden into fact, and then revealed that the fact was an artifact of a wall nobody knew existed. That is the same trick as the rocks and the catchphrase, executed at the scale of the entire series. The thing everyone accepted as background truth was, all along, the biggest clue. The character who drags this structure into the light is the villain the show had been building since its first season, and the way his plan reframes as a paradox is worth tracing carefully. Evil Morty, the eye patch-wearing variant introduced early and revealed slowly, is almost universally misread on first encounter as a conqueror, a dark mirror who wants to rule. But his actual goal, laid out across his scattered appearances and confirmed in the 5th season finale, is the opposite of conquest. He does not want to rule the Ricks. He wants out. His entire multi-season scheme is aimed at breaking the central finite curve open and stepping through into the true infinite, into the part of reality the Ricks abandoned precisely because in that part they are nobody special. When he finally tears the wall down, the show frames it not as a supervillain seizing power, but as a prisoner walking out of a cage that the smartest men in the universe built to flatter themselves. Here is where the structure becomes genuinely paradoxical rather than merely hidden, and it is a paradox of self-reference rather than time. The Ricks built the curve to guarantee they would always be the smartest, but the very act of building a wall to guarantee your supremacy is a confession that your supremacy could not survive an open contest. The wall is proof of the weakness it was built to hide. A being who is truly the smartest across all of existence would have no need to fence off the region where he happened to win. The existence of the fence is the evidence that out in the real infinite there are minds the Ricks could not beat. So the smartest man in the universe is defined by an object that proves he is not, and the object was built by the Ricks themselves, which means their greatest feat of engineering is a monument to their own limitation. The curve is a self-refuting structure, a wall whose entire purpose is undermined by the fact that it had to be built at all. The 7th season made the size of that self-refutation impossible to ignore, and it did so with a single image. When the action briefly crosses outside the curve, the show lingers on what waits out there, a sprawling hellscape of shattered planets and monstrous beings, packed with countless other species who cracked portal travel entirely on their own, with no help from any Rick. Out in that open infinity, Rick is one clever creature among an endless field of them, and the villain who escaped there describes the madness as paradise, precisely because no version of Rick rules it. The show put the limitation on screen and refused to comfort the audience about it. The smartest man in the universe, revealed to be a local champion who never once had to play a road game, standing at the edge of an infinity full of equals and superiors he had spent his whole existence walling himself away from. And then the show sharpened the blade further, staging a contradiction inside the rigged board itself, which ties this hidden structure back to the revenge loop at the show's heart. Even inside the curve, on the stacked field, there is a Rick who beats him. Rick Prime, the original counterpart who murdered Rick's wife and child and set the entire tragedy in motion, evaded capture for decades, stayed a step ahead of the greatest manhunt the multiverse had ever seen, and is described as the superior fighter when the two finally meet. The smartest man in the universe spent the better part of his life unable to catch one specific version of himself, which means the singular ranking was never even true within the walls built to guarantee it. The curve was supposed to ensure a Rick was always on top. It could not even ensure that this Rick was on top of the other Ricks. The rigged game was rigged, and Rick still lost inside it to himself. What makes the central finite curve the definitive proof of the show's design is how perfectly it fits the character it was hidden behind. Rick's defining move, the thing he does at every scale, is to control the conditions of a problem rather than simply solve it. He does not win arguments, he ends them by making the other person feel stupid for starting. He does not negotiate with the Federation, he liquidates their economy. Confronted with a multiverse that might contain beings smarter than him, he and his counterparts did the most Rick thing imaginable. They edited the multiverse. The curve is Rick's whole psychology written across all of creation, a refusal to risk a fair comparison dressed up as supremacy. And the writers planted the pieces of it. The society of Ricks, the endless copies, the suspicious flatness of every playing field, years before they revealed the shape, so that when the wall finally appeared, it would feel not like an invention, but like a confirmation, the answer to a question the show had been quietly asking all along. The structure also explains a fragment the show had been dangling since its earliest days, a backstory it repeatedly insisted was a lie. In the third season premiere, Under Interrogation, Rick shows his captors a memory of his origins, his wife and daughter killed by a rival, his invention of portal travel born from grief. Then he immediately declares the whole thing a fabricated story, a decoy fed to the machine reading his mind. For years, the audience took him at his word and assumed the tragic backstory was a ruse. But the fifth season finale revealed that the backstory was almost entirely true. The only part that had actually been altered was the moment of the breakthrough itself, the discovery of the portal formula, which was messier and more painful than the clean version he preferred to remember. The show planted a true story disguised as a lie, let the audience believe the lie for 2 seasons, and then revealed that the man who insisted none of it was real had been telling the truth about the worst day of his life, hiding his genuine grief inside a claim that the grief was invented. Even his denial was a disguise, and the disguise was planted with the same patience as everything else. There is a strategic reading of the curve that deepens the paradox and connects it to the show's obsession with self-authoring loops. The Ricks built the curve to make themselves the smartest, but the curve is what produced evil Morty, the one being patient enough to weaponize their own structure against them. The cage bred the prisoner who escaped it. The system designed to guarantee Rick's supremacy generated the exact intelligence that would expose the supremacy as hollow and tear the whole thing down. That is a closed loop of consequence. The wall creating the force that destroys the wall. The guarantee of dominance producing the proof of its limits. The Ricks, in trying to eliminate the possibility of a superior mind, created the conditions for one. A Morty who understood them better than they understood themselves, who grasped that their arrogance was a predictable weakness and built his entire plan on the single blind spot that no Morty could ever outthink them. None of this was random, and that is the entire point of dwelling on it. A show that stumbles into its plots does not build a society of duplicates in season 1, establish the flatness of every playing field as an unremarked upon constant, plant a villain whose true goal stays hidden for years, disguise a true backstory as a lie, and then reveal in season 5 that all of it was the visible surface of a single wall that explains the premise of the entire series. That is a structure engineered across a decade, seated in fragments too small to read individually, designed so that the reveal would feel like a key turning in a lock the audience had been staring at the whole time. The central finite curve is the show's largest confession that nothing was random, because the thing that looked most like the show's premise, the given, the unquestioned foundation, turned out to be the most carefully hidden construction of all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wall around the whole show was the biggest planted detail of all, a premise that was secretly a cage. Next, the climb narrows back to the show's most ordinary image, the family in the garage, revealed to be a decades-long ambush hiding in plain sight. Section 7, the family that was a trap. The most ordinary image the show ever offered was a grandfather and grandson in a garage. It is the picture on the poster, the shorthand for the whole series, the comfortable domestic center that all the cosmic chaos revolves around. A drunk old genius, a nervous teenage boy, a workbench, a portal gun, a family in the next room. For most of the run, the audience took that image exactly as presented, a slightly dysfunctional household that happened to contain a man who could open doors to any universe. It felt like the one stable thing in a show about infinite instability, the fixed point, the home. And then the series revealed, across its 5th and 6th seasons, that the home had never been a home at all. It was a stakeout. The family was a trap. And the man in the garage had chosen that specific household, that specific Beth, that specific Morty, for a reason so cold it retroactively poisoned every warm moment that came before. To see why this reveal belongs among the show's great planted structures, the pieces have to be reassembled in the order the writers hid them. The premise the audience accepted accepted was simple. This was Rick's daughter, his grandson, his family, and he had returned to them after a long absence to live in the garage and drag the boy on adventures. Simple, given, unquestioned. The same way the smartest man ranking was unquestioned. But buried underneath that premise, planted in fragments and confirmed only near the end, was a truth that turns the entire domestic setup inside out. This is not Rick's original family. His original wife and daughter were murdered when the daughter was a child, killed by a rival version of himself. In his own reality, there was no Beth who grew up, no grandchildren, no family in the next room. Everything the audience took as the show's stable center was something Rick moved into from outside after his real family was gone. The mechanics of how he came to be there are where the domestic premise curdles into an ambush. Rick spent decades hunting the specific rival who killed his wife and child, and he failed. He could not find him, so he made a calculated decision. He located a dimension whose native Rick had abandoned his own family, a household with an empty space where a grandfather should be, and he slipped into that empty space. He did not choose this family for love. He chose it because its original Rick was gone and might one day return, and Rick wanted to be sitting there waiting when he did. The domestic premise, the grandfather who came back to his daughter's house, is in truth a hunter using his daughter's household as a blind, a stakeout dressed as a homecoming, a man occupying a family's empty chair not to fill it, but to ambush the person who left it. The show confirmed this with a detail so cold it functions as the emotional low point of the whole reveal. The main Morty, the boy the audience had been following since before the series premiered, the one Rick spent every day beside, is not just any grandson. He is the grandson of the rival Rick, the killer. The reality Rick chose to hide in was the killer's home dimension, and the Morty who tags along on every adventure is the killer's own descendant. So the central relationship of the series, the grandfather and grandson bond that anchors everything, is built on Rick living inside his enemy's abandoned life, raising his enemy's grandson, waiting for his enemy to come back so he could kill him. The family was bait. Morty, in the coldest possible reading, was part of the trap, a fixture in the household Rick occupied for the purpose of an ambush that never came, because the killer never returned. The episode that pulled this thread tightest also revealed how far back the planting went, and it did so through a maintenance routine turned catastrophe, which is the show's favorite kind of payoff. In the 6th season premiere, Rick tries to fix his sabotaged portal gun by resetting the portal fluid, and the reset accidentally flings every being who has ever used a portal back to their original dimension. The family is scattered. Jerry is sent to the dimension he was accidentally swapped into 2 seasons earlier. Morty is sent back to his true home reality. Rick is sent back to his. And in following each of them home, the show confirms the hidden geography of the whole series, revealing which dimension each character actually came from and how long the substitution had been running. A routine housekeeping task detonates into a reveal that the family had been quietly reshuffled seasons ago, and that the reshuffling was tracked, consistent, and deliberate the entire time. The detail that proves the writers had been holding this structure carefully is the fate of the home Rick actually came from. When Rick returns to his original dimension, the audience learns that he had kept the entire reality frozen on a time loop of the worst day of his life, the day he lost his wife and daughter, leaving its inhabitants trapped for decades inside that single frozen moment while he built a life elsewhere. He had not simply left his grief behind. He had preserved it, encased an entire dimension in the amber of his worst afternoon, so that the moment of his loss would always exist, unchanging, a shrine he could return to. And inside that frozen home, he had built something else, an artificial recreation of his dead wife, an AI installed in the house to haunt him, a voice that would call to him from the other room and remind him of his failure and urge him toward revenge. The man who insisted nothing mattered had turned his most painful day into a permanent installation and populated it with a ghost of the woman he lost. This recolors the garage completely. The comfortable domestic center, the man tinkering at his workbench while the family lives its life around him, is revealed revealed to be the surface behavior of a man who kept a whole reality frozen in grief in another dimension, who built a hologram of his dead wife rather than let a living person near, who moved into a borrowed family as a stakeout, and who tells everyone constantly that attachment is meaningless while secretly organizing his entire existence around a single loss he could not release. The home was never the stable thing the show pretended it was. It was the most elaborate avoidance mechanism in the series, a place to hide from a grief he had literally locked in a time loop somewhere else. The stability was the disguise. Underneath it was a man in a permanent stakeout against his own pain. And here the show planted one of its finest small callbacks, a detail that proves the writers were thinking about this structure long before they revealed it, which ties this domestic trap back to the show's habit of hiding meaning in throwaway specifics. When Rick and his rivals files for a particular weapon are seen, both bear the same absurd, deliberately gross code name. Rick reveals in one episode that he names all his files with this same ridiculous phrase, a personal quirk, a joke. And then, in a later episode, the rival's file for his ultimate weapon is shown bearing the exact same name. The two Ricks, the hero and the killer, independently use the identical filing joke, because they are, at bottom, the same man. That shared quirk is a tiny planted proof of a huge idea, that the nemesis Rick spent his life hunting is not an other, but a self, that the family Rick occupies is his enemy's family the way it could have been his own, that the line between the man in the garage and the monster he chases is thinner than either would admit. The joke in the file name is the whole tragedy compressed into a background gag. The reveal of the family as trap also retroactively explains a piece of Rick's behavior that had puzzled viewers for years, which is how the show tends to redeem its coldest details. Rick's professed philosophy, repeated endlessly, is that everyone is replaceable, that in an infinite multiverse, any lost person can be swapped for a copy from a neighboring reality, that attachment is a weakness for lesser minds. But his actual behavior contradicted this constantly. He did not replace his dead wife with a version from another dimension, though he easily could have. He did not simply grab a surviving Beth and call it even. Instead, he spent decades hunting one specific killer, refusing to move on, unable to treat his loss as the replaceable event his philosophy insisted it was. The domestic trap explains why. His nihilism was a story he told himself, a coping mechanism laid over a grief so specific and so unbearable that no copy could touch it. He preached replaceability while living a life that proved at every turn that some things cannot be replaced. The gap between what he said and what he did was the hidden structure, and the family as trap reveal exposed it. The show even names this gap out loud, in a moment of unusual honesty, and the way it does so demonstrates how deliberately the contradiction was built. In the same reveal-heavy stretch, Rick refers to his rival as the real deal when it comes to having no attachments, the one Rick who actually embodies the nihilistic philosophy, because that rival genuinely abandoned his family and never looked back. The implication is stark. Rick C-137, the hero, is not the true nihilist he pretends to be. His nihilism is adapted, worn out of necessity, a mask over a man who cares far too much and lost far too much. The real nihilist is the villain, the one who felt nothing, who killed a wife and a daughter out of pure spite when his offer of companionship was refused. The show set up two versions of the same man, one who claims not to care and secretly does, one who genuinely does not, and used the contrast to expose the hero's philosophy as the lie it always was. That contrast was planted seasons before it paid off. In every moment, Rick insisted he was above attachment while behaving like a man ruled by it. What makes the family a trap reveal so devastating is that it does not erase the warmth that came before. It complicates it. Because even though Rick chose this family as a stakeout, even though he moved in to ambush an enemy, the show is careful to establish that somewhere in the years of waiting, the bait became real to him. In the very episode that reveals the frozen home and the hologram life, Rick decides to let it go, to dismantle the time loop, to stop haunting himself with the ghost of his dead wife, because he has come to genuinely care about the borrowed family he settled among. The trap caught the trapper. The stakeout became a home despite itself. The man who moved into a family to hunt his enemy stayed because he fell into loving them, which is its own kind of paradox. A bond that began as a cold calculation and became the one true attachment left in his life. That transformation is the show's argument in miniature, and it is why the family as trap belongs in a survey of the series' hidden design. The writers planted a domestic premise that looked simple and stable, let the audience love it as the show's warm center, and then revealed that it was a stakeout, a substitution, a trap built on grief and revenge. And then, having exposed the coldness underneath the warmth, they revealed a further layer that the coldness had, over the years of the show the audience had actually watched, quietly turned back into warmth. That the fake family had become a real one. That the man hiding from his pain had accidentally built the one thing that could ease it. Nothing about the family was random. The choice of dimension was strategic. The Morty was the enemy's grandson. The stability was a disguise for a stakeout. And the love, when it finally arrived, was real precisely because it was never supposed to be there at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The family that looked like a home turned out to be a trap, its warmth hiding a structure of grief and calculation. Next, the focus turns to the show's fondest paradox, a universe inside a universe inside a universe. Proof that the series was never a line, but a spiral folding endlessly into itself. Section 8. The universe inside the universe. The show has one paradox it loves more than any other, and it keeps returning to it in different costumes because it is the shape that describes the series itself. A man builds a smaller world to serve his own convenience, and then discovers, to his fury, that inside that smaller world, another mind has built a smaller world still, for the same reason, and inside that one, another. A chain of exploitation folding down into itself with no bottom and, by implication, no top. It is not a straight line of cause and effect. It is a spiral, a structure that repeats at every scale, each layer a copy of the layer above it, each ruler certain he sits at the summit, and each one wrong. The show returns to this spiral so often, in so many forms, that it stops being a gag and becomes a confession about how the whole series is built. The cleanest version arrives in the second season, in an episode that begins with the most mundane problem imaginable. Rick's car battery is dead. To fix it, he takes Morty inside the battery, and the audience learns that the battery is not a battery at all. It is a microverse, a complete miniature universe Rick created and seeded with intelligent life, whose entire civilization unknowingly generates electricity for his car through a technology he gave them disguised as a gift. He calls it his power source. The inhabitants call it the engine of their whole way of life. None of them suspect that their cosmos sits inside a battery belonging to a drunk man in another reality, or that their daily labor charges his vehicle. Rick built an entire universe of conscious beings, populated it, deceived it, and enslaved it, all so he would never have to pay for gas. The scale of the cruelty is the joke, and the scale of the cruelty is also the point. But the episode does not stop at one layer, and this is where the gag becomes a genuine paradox of infinite regress. Inside Rick's microverse, the smartest scientist, a being named Zeep, has independently invented the very same trick. Zeep has built his own miniature universe to power his world, making Rick's gift obsolete, which is why the battery stopped working. And when Rick, Morty, and Zeep travel down into Zeep's creation, they discover that inside it, another scientist has built a third universe, a teenyverse, for the same purpose. Exploitation nested within exploitation, each genius certain he stands at the top, none of them aware of the larger hand wrapped around their entire sky. Rick built a universe to avoid pushing his car, and the episode uses the discovery to land a genuinely vertiginous idea. If Rick's universe is inside a battery, whose battery is Rick's universe inside? The spiral goes down forever, and the show quietly asks whether it goes up forever too, whether Rick himself is somebody's microverse, a clever creature laboring inside a larger being's convenience without knowing it. The episode plants a small visual proof that the writers were building this spiral on purpose rather than stumbling into it, and it rewards the same close attention every other stop on this climb has rewarded. When Rick first arrives among the inhabitants of his microverse, he greets them by flipping them off, and then tells Morty that he has taught these people the gesture means peace among worlds, a private joke at the expense of a civilization that worships him. Later, deeper down, inside Zeep's miniverse, Zeep greets his own inhabitants with a peace sign, the ordinary two-fingered gesture, and tells Morty that he told his people it means peace among worlds. The two scientists, on two different layers, have played the identical prank on their identical slaves, each teaching a conquered population that an insult is a blessing. It is the same joke twice, at two depths, and the repetition is the whole argument in a single throwaway detail. The spiral is not just a structure of exploitation. It is a structure of the same exploitation, copied down through the layers, each god behaving exactly like the god above him, because each god is, functionally, the same man. The show planted the peace among worlds gag on one layer, specifically so it could echo it on the next, proving that the levels are not merely stacked, but identical, self-similar all the way down. That question of whether the spiral goes up as well as down is not idle, because the show had already planted the answer in its own imagery long before this episode, which is the kind of deep-cut consistency that proves the spiral was always the plan. The series is built on the premise that reality is infinite and layered, that there are universes inside universes, that scale is meaningless, because there is always a larger and a smaller. The microverse episode simply makes literal a structure the show had been implying since the beginning, and it connects directly to the central finite curve revealed seasons later, because the curve is the same shape viewed from a different angle. The curve is a slice of reality the Ricks fenced off to guarantee their supremacy, a smaller region carved out of a larger infinity, exactly as the microverse is a smaller universe carved out to serve a larger one. Rick, who built a universe to power his car, lives inside a walled-off region other Ricks built to flatter themselves, which is itself a bubble inside a true infinite that dwarfs it. The exploiter is the exploited. The man at the top of one spiral is near the bottom of another. The show planted this idea as a car battery gag and paid it off seasons later as the explanation for the entire series. There is a further turn of the screw buried in how the episode resolves, and it deepens the horror rather than releasing it. Rick does not free the microverse. He does not dismantle the exploitation or apologize for it. He wins by convincing Zeep that continuing to build mini-verses is dangerous, forcing Zeep's people back onto the power-generating devices Rick originally gave them, which restarts the flow of electricity to Rick's car. The status quo is restored, which means the slavery is restored, which means the episode ends with the spiral fully intact and humming along exactly as it did before, powering a vehicle for a man who will never think about it again. The lesson Rick teaches Zeep is not that enslaving a universe is wrong. It is that enslaving a universe is unwise if a larger predator might smash your battery in retaliation. The morality never enters the calculation. Only the leverage does. And that is the coldest possible confirmation of the spiral's logic, that every layer runs on the same amoral arithmetic, that being higher up the chain grants no wisdom and no mercy, only a bigger hand to wrap around a smaller sky. The spiral appears again in the video game called Roy, and tracing its recurrence reveals how deliberately the show keeps returning to the same structure. Roy is a virtual reality life simulator in an arcade, a game where a player puts on a headset and lives an entire ordinary human lifetime, decades passing in minutes, before dying and removing the headset. On the surface, it is a one-off gag about immersive gaming, but the show brings it back in a later season and folds it into into the spiral. When a power surge splinters Morty's consciousness across the billions of characters inside the game, every non-player person in Roy's world turns out to be a fragment of Morty, each unaware of what they are, each living a small life inside a simulation, inside a headset, inside the arcade, inside the show. To rescue him, Rick enters the game and tries to tell these fragments the truth, that they are all pieces of one boy, that their entire world is a game, that a larger reality contains them. And they refuse to believe it. They treat the truth as a cult, a religion, an absurd doctrine, and go to war over it. That refusal is the spiral's cruelest joke, and it rhymes exactly with the microverse. Zeep, told that his universe was built by Rick to power a car, reacts with rage and denial, attacking Rick, unable to accept that his entire cosmos is somebody's appliance. The Morty fragments in Roy, told that their world is a game and they are pieces of one person, react the same way, treating the truth as heresy. In both cases, a being learns that its reality is a smaller layer inside a larger one, that it was created to serve a purpose it never chose. And in both cases, the being cannot bear the knowledge and rejects it. The show is making the same argument twice, in two different costumes, that the inhabitants of any given layer are constitutionally unable to perceive the layer above them, that the structure is invisible from the inside, which is precisely why the audience keeps missing the show's own structure until it is pointed out. The microverse citizens cannot see Rick, the Roy fragments cannot see the arcade, and the viewer, laughing along, cannot see the spiral until the show forces them to. The spiral has a temporal cousin, and it appears in the episode about the save point device, which turns the nested universe structure into a critique of the show's own oldest rule. Morty, tired of Rick dismissing his ideas, goads him into building a device that works like a video game save point, letting Morty mark a moment in time and return to it to undo his mistakes. Morty uses it to live without consequence, committing crimes and pranks and resetting each time until he falls in love and loses the relationship and finally concedes that consequences are what give choices meaning. And then Rick reveals the trap. The device was never a save point. It was never time travel, which Rick famously refuses to do. Every time Morty pressed the button, the device isolated the moment, split Morty's probable selves, and moved him to a nearly identical alternate dimension, killing the Morty who was already there so that Morty could take his place. There were no do-overs. Morty did it over and over, leaving a trail of dead Mortys across dimensions, each reset a murder disguised as a reload. This is the spiral again, worn as a paradox about repetition and consequence, and it connects the nested universe idea back to the loops explored earlier in the climb. The save point device does not undo actions. It relocates the actor into a fresh copy of reality, exactly as the microverse and the curve are fresh copies of reality carved out for a purpose. Each of Morty's resets is a new layer, a new dimension, nearly identical to the last, with a Morty already living in it who has to be erased for the illusion of a clean slate to hold. The show explicitly connects this to the movie about a magician who duplicates and kills himself to perform a trick, invoking a story where every reset is secretly a death. And Rick, revealing all this, turns out not even to be Morty's own Rick, but another Rick, who observes that all Ricks have a vat of acid, which is to say that this exploitation, this treatment of copies as disposable, is universal across every version of the man. The spiral is not one Rick's cruelty, it is the nature of Rick itself, repeated at every layer. There is a detail in the Save Point episode that reveals the show grading its own structure, which is the kind of self-awareness that makes the design undeniable. At the very end, Rick admits that this entire elaborate lesson, the device, the deaths, the merging of dimensions, was staged in an alternate reality he chose, specifically because he did not want to waste their real home dimension just to prove a point to Morty. So the whole episode, the whole cruel demonstration, happened inside a layer Rick selected as expendable, a smaller universe treated as scratch paper. The episode about the horror of treating copies as disposable was itself set in a copy Rick treated as disposable. The show wrapped its critique of the spiral inside another turn of the spiral, and it did so as a punchline, trusting the audience to feel the vertigo. That is not an accident. That is a show that understands understands its own recurring shape well enough to hide it inside itself one more time. The reason the spiral matters so much to the larger argument is that it describes the show's method as well as its themes. A series built on nested layers, on universes inside universes and copies inside copies, is a series that thinks in terms of structures that repeat at every scale. And a series that thinks that way is a series that plants the same idea in a car battery, a video game, and a time travel device, trusting that the repetition will eventually become visible as design. The spiral is the show's signature because the spiral is how the show is made. Each episode is a smaller version of the whole, running the same 8-beat cycle. Each season is a larger version of an episode, running a longer arc. The microverse is a smaller version of the curve, which is a smaller version of the true infinite. The show is fractal, self-similar at every scale, and the nested universe episodes are the places where it shows the audience its own fractal nature most directly, dressed as a joke about a dead car battery. The spiral also carries the show's deepest thematic wound, and it ties back to Rick's grief in a way that makes the whole structure cohere. Rick builds smaller universes to serve his convenience because he treats consciousness as a renewable resource, as something to be used and discarded, and he treats it that way for the same reason he treats his family as a stakeout and his catchphrase as a joke. He is a man who cannot bear attachment, who has organized his entire existence around not feeling a specific loss. And the way he manages that is by insisting nothing is real, nothing is unique, everything is a copy, every layer replaceable. The spiral is that philosophy made literal. If universes are disposable batteries, if Mortys are interchangeable across dimensions, if resets are just relocations, then nothing Rick loves can ever be truly lost, because there is always another copy one layer down. The nested universe structure is Rick's coping mechanism rendered as cosmology. He built a reality of infinite disposable copies so that no single loss would have to matter, and the show keeps proving that the losses matter anyway. There is a quiet devastation in recognizing that the spiral is not only how Rick exploits others, but how he protects himself, and the two turn out to be the same motion. Every layer he builds below him is a layer of insulation between his own heart and the fact of loss. If he can always drop down into a smaller universe, or hop sideways into a fresher copy of his own, then he never has to stand still in the one reality where his wife is gone and stays gone. The spiral is an escape hatch with no floor, an infinite basement he can keep descending into so that grief can never corner him. But the show is merciless about the flaw in that architecture, because descending forever is not the same as escaping. It is only the same as running. And a man who can always go one layer down is a man who never arrives anywhere, never stays, never lets a single reality become solid enough to hold him. The spiral promises Rick that nothing is final, and in exchange it guarantees that nothing is real, which is the exact bargain his whole life is built on, and the exact bargain the show spends its run dismantling. That is why the spiral is never comforting in the show, even when it is funny. Zeep's universe is real, and its suffering is real, and Rick smashing it destroys real lives. The Roy fragments are real pieces of a real boy, and their war is a real tragedy. The dead Mortys from the save point device are real deaths, even if they were framed as reloads. The show refuses to let the nested structure become an excuse for the cruelty it enables, refuses to let Rick off the hook for treating copies as disposable, because the whole emotional engine of the series depends on the audience feeling that the copies are not disposable, that a single life inside a single layer still counts. The spiral is Rick's argument that nothing matters, and the show keeps deploying it over and over to prove the opposite. Every time a lower layer bleeds, the show is quietly insisting that the blood is real, that being small does not make a life less, this, that the being at the bottom of the stack feels its own existence with exactly the same weight as the being at the top. The universe inside the universe is the show's fondest paradox because it is the show's own portrait. A structure that repeats at every scale, invisible from the inside, planted as a joke and paid off as a cosmology, describing both a car battery and the entire multiverse, both a video game and the nature of Rick himself. Nothing in it was random, because a spiral, like a loop, cannot contain randomness. It can only contain the same shape again and again, folding down and, the show quietly insists, folding up, until the man who thought he sat at the top realizes he is just another layer in someone else's convenience. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The spiral revealed the show's own shape, a structure that repeats at every scale, planted as a joke and paid off as a cosmology. Next, the climb reaches the episodes where the series stops hiding its structure and starts talking about it, where Rick and Morty learn they are inside a story. Section 9. The show that knows it is a show. Sooner or later, a series this obsessed with structure was going to stop hiding its structure and start talking about it. For most of its run, Rick and Morty buried its design, planting seeds in the scenery, coding its wounds into catchphrases, folding its cosmology into a car battery, trusting the audience to eventually notice. But in a handful of its strangest episodes, the show does something bolder. It stops burying the design and drags it into the open, letting Rick and Morty become aware that they are inside a story, that plot and canon and character development are forces acting on them, that the randomness they swim through is authored. And in doing so, the series makes explicit the argument it had been making silently all along, that a story is the least random thing there is, because a story, by definition, is a structure someone built on purpose. The clearest of these episodes traps the family aboard a train, and the train is a machine made of narrative itself. It is called the story train, and it runs on the mechanics of storytelling, a setting where characters openly discuss plot, canon, serialization, and character arcs as physical realities they can be crushed by. Passengers can be killed by bad writing. The train generates rapid-fire vignettes, little self-contained stories, loosely bound together, and Rick navigates the threat not by fighting his way out, but by reasoning about narrative structure as though it were a physical system to be hacked. He talks about the rules of storytelling the way he would talk about the rules of physics, because on this train, they are the same thing. The episode is a comedy about being trapped inside a story, and it is played for laughs. But underneath the laughs is a genuine idea about the show's protagonist, that a mind smart enough to see the structure of its universe might eventually see the structure of its own story, and would find the discovery exhausting rather than freeing. The most revealing moment in that episode is the one discussed earlier in The Climb, when Rick unrolls the schematic of the train to plan his route to the engine, and the schematic turns out to be the story circle. The 8-beat cycle the creator uses to write every episode, printed as a prop, walked along by the character trying to escape a story about storytelling. This is the show handing the audience the key to its own construction inside an episode about construction, and it is worth pausing on what an extraordinary act of confidence that is. A series that had spent years hiding its structure chose, in an episode about narrative structure, to literally draw its structure on screen as a map. The randomness the audience thought they were watching was revealed in that single prop to be a loop the writers follow every time, and the show revealed it as a joke about how mechanical and commercialized storytelling has become, because the train is also a piece of merchandise, a product spat out by the same civilization that built the Citadel. That detail, that the story train is merchandise, connects the episode to the show's deepest anxiety about itself, and it is not random either. The train is a product designed to generate stories on demand, endless serialized content, which is exactly what a long-running television series is. The episode is the show looking at its own commercial existence and flinching, aware that it is a machine for producing narrative to be sold, aware that the story circle it runs on is a formula, aware that the fans want more vignettes, more canon, more character development forever. And it stages that anxiety as a literal train the characters are trapped on, unable to get off, forced to keep keep generating stories until they can hack their way to the engine. The show that spent a decade proving nothing was random turns out to be nervous about that very fact, worried that a story following a formula this closely might be a machine rather than an art, a product rather than a creation. The series pushes the meta-awareness further in a 6th season episode that sends the family beyond the fourth wall entirely, into a layer of reality populated by entities who know they are fictional. Here, Rick does not merely reason about narrative structure. He confronts the possibility that he himself is a character, a fiction, a being written by someone outside his reality. And he treats the revelation with the same irritated competence he brings to any other engineering problem. Because to a mind like Rick's, the discovery that he might be a character is just one more structure to be understood and exploited, one more layer in the spiral. The episode plays with the idea genuinely, letting Rick grapple with the notion that his free will is authored, that his choices were written, that the randomness of his life is the product of a writer's room. And the show's argument underneath the play is that this discovery drains meaning rather than adding it, that a mind clever enough to see it as a story would find the seeing less like liberation than like one more reason to stop caring about a plot that was never going to mean anything regardless. This is where the meta-episodes connect to the character's core wound, and it is the connection that makes them more than clever exercises. Rick's whole philosophy is that nothing matters, that meaning is an illusion, that in an infinite multiverse every event is undone a billion times over. The discovery that he is a character in a story is, for Rick, not a horror, but a confirmation. Of course he is a character. Of course his choices are authored. Of course the randomness is fake. It fits perfectly with everything he already believes. That existence is a structure imposed from outside, that free will is a comforting lie, that the appearance of choice hides the reality of determination. The show uses its own meta-awareness to deepen its portrait of Rick, because a nihilist who learns he is fictional is a nihilist proven right, and the show lets that be simultaneously a joke and a genuine sadness. The man who believes nothing is real finds out he is not real and shrugs. But the show is too disciplined to let Rick's nihilism win, even here, and the way it resists is the whole point of the meta-episodes. Because a story, unlike Rick's random multiverse, is not meaningless. A story is the opposite of meaningless. It is the most designed thing that exists, every element chosen, every payoff planted, every loop closed on purpose. When the show reveals that Rick is a character, it is not confirming his nihilism, it is refuting it. Because the very fact that he is inside a story means that everything around him was authored with intent, that nothing is random, that the design he refuses to believe in is the fundamental truth of his existence. Rick thinks discovering he is fictional proves nothing matters. The show knows it proves the opposite, that he lives inside the most carefully constructed reality imaginable, a reality where his creator planted the seeds of his grief in the first season and honored them for a decade. The meta-episodes are the show's rebuttal to its own hero, staged as comedy, arguing that a written life is a meaningful life precisely because it was written. The meta-awareness was there long before these dedicated episodes, planted in the show's smallest habits, which proves it was always part of the design rather than a late series gimmick. From the beginning, one character besides Rick could break the fourth wall and address the audience directly, the small friend introduced during the Parasite episode, who appears in post-credit scenes to speak to the viewer. The show established, in its second season, that the boundary between the story and the audience was permeable, that at least one character could see out. And the creator's own theory about that character, the idea that he is a being not bound by ordinary space and time, who inserts himself into the gaps in perception, is a theory about a character who exists partly outside the story, who can see the structure the other characters cannot. The show planted a fourth wall breaker early and used him for years before it ever built a dedicated meta-episode, which means the awareness that the show is a show was seeded into the series almost from the start. Even the pilot, examined through this lens, was already meta, which closes a loop back to the very beginning of the climb. Rick's closing chant in the first episode, the stuttering incantation about 100 years of adventures over and over over forever, ends with him reciting a web address, a .com, breaking through the fiction to reference the show's own promotional existence. In the show's opening minutes, its lead character was already half aware that he was a product, that his adventures were content, that the whole thing was a thing being sold. The chant that seemed like drunken nonsense was, among everything else it was doing, the show acknowledging its own commercial nature. A character reciting the URL where his own randomness could be purchased and consumed. The meta-awareness the dedicated episodes make explicit was buried in the pilot, planted in a chant, waiting like everything else. What makes the meta-episodes the natural capstone before the final synthesis is that they collapse the distinction the whole climb has been built on, the distinction between the show's random surface and its designed depth. In an ordinary episode, the design is hidden, and the paradox is the place where it briefly pokes through. In the meta-episodes, there is no hiding. The design is the subject. The story is about being in a story. The structure is drawn on screen as a train schematic. The characters debate their own canon, and in dropping the disguise, the show confirms everything the paradoxes have been implying, that the randomness was always a surface, that the structure was always underneath, that a series which appears to be chaos was at every level a story, and a story is the least random thing there is. There is a risk in this kind of self-awareness, and the show knows it, which is why it treats its own meta-episodes with such ambivalence. A story that talks too much about being a story can vanish up its own structure, can become a hall of mirrors with no heart, can substitute cleverness for feeling. The series flirts with this danger constantly, and mostly avoids it by keeping the meta-awareness tethered to Rick's grief, to the emotional engine underneath. The story train is not just a joke about narrative. It is a trap Rick has to escape, and his escape is characteristically ruthless. The revelation that he is a character is not just a puzzle. It is one more confirmation of the nihilism he uses to avoid his pain. The show never lets the meta become weightless, never lets the awareness that it is a show cancel out the reasons the show matters. Because the whole point of the design is that the design serves the feeling. The structure exists to deliver the wound. The loops exist to make Morty's existence mean something. The planted seeds exist to make the grief land when it finally arrives. A story that knows it is a story, in this series, is a story arguing that knowing it is a story does not make it meaningless. The meta-episodes, in the end, are the show saying out loud what the paradoxes said in code. Nothing was random. The randomness was a costume. Underneath every burp and swerve and throwaway gag was a structure, an author, a plan, a loop being closed, a seed being planted, a payoff being set up years in advance. And the show was so confident in this, so aware of it, that it built entire episodes about the fact of it, drew its own blueprint on screen as a prop, let its characters debate their own canon, and used the whole apparatus to refute its hero's belief that existence is noise. Rick thinks he lives in chaos. The show keeps proving he lives in a story. And a story is designed, from its first frame to its last, by someone who knew where it was going. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The dedicated meta-episodes dropped the show's disguise, drawing its own blueprint on screen and refuting its hero's belief that existence is noise. Next, the climb reaches its final stop, the full synthesis, where every loop and seed and buried structure resolves into a single argument about why the most nihilistic show on television turned out to be the most carefully authored. Section 10. Nothing was ever an accident. After all the loops and the seeds and the buried walls, the question the whole climb was circling comes into focus. And it is not whether the show is designed, because that has been settled many times over across these hours. The real question, the one that gives all this design its weight, is why? Why would a series work this hard to hide its structure? Why disguise a decade of meticulous planning as chaos? Why let a whole generation shout a catchphrase for laughs without hearing the grief inside it? Why bury an apocalypse in the scenery? Why plant a villain's true purpose across 5 seasons? Why build a wall around the entire multiverse and reveal it as the premise all along? The answer is the show's final argument about itself, and it is quietly devastating, because it turns out that the disguise was never a trick played on the audience. It was a portrait of the man at the center, a show built to look like his philosophy, so that its structure could refute it. Rick believes nothing matters. This is the bedrock of the character, stated in 100 ways across every season. In an infinite multiverse, every version of everyone exists a billion times over. Every tragedy is undone in a billion neighboring realities. Every choice is meaningless because it was always going to be made some other way, somewhere else. His whole worldview is a case for randomness, for the idea that existence is noise, with no author and no purpose, that meaning is a comforting lie people tell themselves to get through the day, and the show he lives in is the precise opposite of what he believes. It is a story authored with obsessive care, where a joke in the second episode is a promise kept in the 9th season, where nothing is noise and everything is a setup waiting for its payoff. The most nihilistic character in modern television is the puppet of the most tightly plotted comedy in modern television, and the gap between what he believes about his world and what is actually true about it is the engine under every paradox laid out across these hours. Trace the loops again, and the pattern is unmistakable. The Snake War authors itself, a closed causal loop where a book has no writer, and a Christmas hat has no buyer, and a black eye is caused by its own future, a structure so tightly sealed it cannot contain a single random element. The grandson may cause his own existence, a boy who exists only because he ensured he would. The show's second lead trapped in the same self-authoring shape as a snake's instruction manual. The catchphrase, the emptiest sound the show could invent, secretly carried its truest meaning from the first season, a cry for help disguised as a joke, planted and honored for years. The apocalypse sat in the scenery on a rock 2 episodes before it detonated, on screen the whole time, waiting for someone to look. The wall around the whole multiverse was disguised as the premise, the smartest man ranking revealed to be a rigged result the Ricks engineered before the first episode aired. The family was a stakeout wearing the costume of a home. The nested universes proved the show was a spiral, self-similar at every scale, and the meta-episodes dropped the disguise entirely, drawing the show's own blueprint on screen and letting the characters debate their own canon. Every one of those is the same act performed at a different scale, the act of hiding design inside apparent chaos and trusting the audience to eventually find it. And the reason the show performs this act, over and over, is that it is dramatizing the difference between how Rick sees his life and how his life actually is. Rick, up close, inside every scene, sees only randomness. He sees a meaningless multiverse of disposable copies, a life of noise, adventures that add up to nothing. The audience, invited to step back across the whole run, sees the opposite, a structure so tight that nothing in it is wasted, a story where the grief planted in Season 1 pays off in Season 7, where the villain's escape was set up before anyone knew he was a villain, where the premise itself was a clue. The show is the argument. Its structure is the rebuttal to its hero's philosophy. Rick insists nothing is connected, and the show connects everything behind his back. And the space between those two facts is where the whole series lives. This is why the disguise matters so much, why the show works so hard to look random. If the design were obvious, the argument would fail. A show that wore its structure on its sleeve would simply be a well-plotted show, and Rick's nihilism would sit beside it as an unrelated character trait. But by disguising its design as chaos, by making itself look exactly like the random, meaningless universe Rick believes in, the show sets a trap. It invites the audience to see the world the way Rick sees it, as noise, as disconnected chaos, as a pile of throwaway gags. And then, paradox by paradox, it reveals that the noise was a symphony, that the chaos was choreography, that the throwaway gags were load-bearing. The audience is made to experience Rick's nihilism and then made to watch it disproven, which is a far more powerful argument than simply being told that Rick is wrong. The show does not lecture, it demonstrates, by hiding its meaning and then revealing it, that meaning was there all along, invisible only to those standing too close. The genius of the method is that it mirrors the show's deepest theme about Rick himself, the theme buried in the catchphrase and the frozen home dimension and the family that was a trap. Rick is a man who who hides his grief inside jokes, who codes his pain as cheer, who buries the thing that matters most inside the thing that looks most disposable. His catchphrase is a cry for help disguised as nonsense. His home is a shrine disguised as a garage. His revenge is a purpose disguised as nihilism. And the show is built the same way, hiding its meaning inside its jokes, burying its structure inside its chaos, coding its most careful design as its most careless surface. The show is Rick. It behaves the way he behaves, concealing what matters inside what looks like it does not. And the audience has to do to the show exactly what Bird Person did to the catchphrase: translate the surface to find the truth underneath. The series is not just about a man who hides his pain in jokes. It is a series that hides its meaning in jokes, which makes the form and the content the same thing. And here the show's argument reaches its sharpest edge. Because if the show is designed, and Rick is inside the show, then Rick is designed too. And his belief in randomness is the belief of an authored being who cannot see his own author. This is the final paradox, the one that contains all the others. Rick's nihilism is itself a plot point. His conviction that nothing matters was written by someone for whom everything about Rick matters. Someone who planted his grief in the first season and paid it off across a decade. Someone who made his every choice serve a structure Rick cannot perceive. The most designed thing in the show is the character's belief that nothing is designed. Rick is a written argument against writing, a planned character who preaches that nothing is planned, a load-bearing figure in a structure who insists there is no structure. He is wrong about his world in the most fundamental way possible, and he is wrong precisely because he cannot step back far enough to see the shape he is part of. The meta-episodes make this explicit, and it is worth returning to what they actually prove. When the show reveals that Rick might be a character, Rick treats it as confirmation of his nihilism, more evidence that his choices are authored and therefore meaningless. But the show knows the opposite is true. Being a character does not make Rick meaningless. It makes him the product of intent, of design, of an author who chose every element of him on purpose. A random universe would be one with no author, where events are genuinely noise. A story is a universe with an author, where every event was chosen. Rick discovering he is in a story should be the death of his nihilism, not its confirmation, because it proves that the design he refuses to believe in is the deepest truth of his existence. The show lets him misread this, lets him take the revelation as more proof that nothing matters. And the tragedy of that misreading is the whole tragedy of the character. He is standing inside the proof that his life was authored with care, and he reads it as proof that his life is noise. That misreading is the exact failure the show has been diagnosing from the beginning, the failure to step back. Rick can see the structure of atoms, the structure of the multiverse, the structure of the central finite curve, the structure of storytelling itself. He can see every structure except the one he is inside, the one that would reveal his life as meaningful. And the reason he cannot see it is the same reason he shelved time travel, the same reason he built the frozen home, the same reason he coded his catchphrase as a joke. He does not want to see it, because seeing it would mean admitting that his life matters, that his grief matters, that the people around him matter, and admitting that would mean feeling the loss he has spent his entire existence avoiding. His nihilism is not a conclusion, it is a defense. And the show's structure, its relentless proof that nothing is random, is the thing his defense exists to deny. This is what elevates the show above a clever puzzle box, above a collection of Easter eggs and callbacks for fans to catalog. The design is not there to be admired, it is there to make an argument about meaning, an argument the show could not make any other way. If the series simply told the audience that life has meaning, it would be a platitude, easily dismissed, the kind of thing Rick would mock in a heartbeat. Instead, the show enacts the argument. It builds a universe that looks exactly like the meaningless chaos Rick believes in, and then it proves, piece by piece, seed by seed, loop by loop, that the chaos was a story all along, that nothing was wasted, that every apparent accident was placed with intent. The audience audience does not have to take the show's word that meaning exists. They can watch it emerge from the noise, can feel the moment a throwaway gag becomes a gut punch, can experience the design revealing itself. And in that experience is the rebuttal to Rick, more convincing than any speech, that a life which looks random from the inside can be revealed from far enough back to have been authored with care. The show even dramatizes the two ways of seeing in its characters. Rick, up close, sees noise, but the audience is invited to be the author's proxy, to step back, to hold the whole run in view, to see the connections Rick cannot. And occasionally the show gives Rick a glimpse of the larger view, in the rare moments he acts against his own philosophy, when he chooses this family over infinite alternatives, when he lets go of the frozen home, when he stays instead of running. Those moments are the moments Rick briefly sees what the audience sees, that some things are not replaceable, that some connections are load-bearing, that his life has a shape and the shape has meaning, and every time he retreats, unable to hold the view for long, sliding back into the noise, because the noise is safer than the meaning. The show never lets him keep the larger perspective, because a man who could keep it would be healed, and the honest portrait of a man built like Rick is not a cure, but an oscillation, brief glimpses of design followed by a return to the comfort of believing it is all random. So the disguise, the show's decade-long masquerade as chaos, turns out to serve the deepest purpose available to it. It is not a trick played on the audience for the fun of the reveal. It is the show becoming its own subject, building itself in the image of the man it is about, hiding its meaning the way he hides his, so that the act of watching the show is the act of translating him. To see the design under the chaos is to see the grief under the jokes, the purpose under the nihilism, the love under the cruelty. The structure is the character. The paradoxes are the places where both crack open at once, where the design shows through the chaos and the pain shows through the humor. And they are the same crack, because in this show, the form and the wound are one thing. That is why a 2-hour walk through the paradoxes was worth taking, and why the paradoxes were the right path through the series. They are not trivia. They are the load-bearing joints of the whole structure, the places where the show's secret architecture becomes visible, and each one carries the same lesson. The snake war that authors itself proves the show can build a structure with no loose ends. The grandson who causes himself proves the show's most important figure is caught in a loop that makes him necessary. The catchphrase proves the emptiest thing is the fullest. The apocalypse in the scenery proves the background is never background. The wall around the multiverse proves the premise itself was a clue. The family that was a trap proves the warmth was hiding a structure of grief. The universe inside the universe proves the show is a spiral, designed at every scale. And the show that knows it is a show proves the whole thing out loud, that a story is the least random thing there is. Put them together and they resolve into a single claim. The claim the show spent a decade making one paradox at a time. Nothing was ever an accident. Not the burps, not the swerves, not the throwaway gags, not the catchphrase, not the rocks, not the villain, not the wall, not the family, not the loops. All of it was authored, planted, tracked, and paid off by people keeping a careful ledger, disguised as chaos, so that the eventual revelation of its order would land as a rebuttal to the chaos its hero believes in. The show that looks most like proof that nothing matters is, underneath, the most careful proof available that everything does, that meaning survives even in a universe that appears to be noise, that a life which feels random from the inside can be authored with intent from a vantage the character cannot reach. Rick spent the whole series insisting he was too smart to be caught in a story. He was caught in the most carefully constructed story on the air, and it was constructed in part to prove him wrong. He preached that repetition drains meaning, and the show made its most repeated figure its most meaningful. He preached that copies are disposable, and the show made every copy count. He preached that nothing is connected, and the show connected everything, patiently, across a decade, in the scenery and the catchphrases and the walls and the loops, until the connections were impossible to deny. The smartest man in in the universe never noticed, but the show noticed, and it left the evidence everywhere, in plain sight, on rocks and in file names, and in a drunken chant in the pilot, waiting for anyone willing to step back far enough to see that the chaos was a symphony, and that nothing in it, from the first burp to the last portal, was ever, for a single frame, an accident. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.